So for those of you who do not know, the Ivany report is a wide-ranging document put together by the Commission on Building a New Economy after conducting town hall-like information sessions and loosely drawing from past social, economic, media, and policy sources. Again, just for general information, since there are people here from across Canada who may not have read the report or been privy to the report, the general findings of the report are dark and gloomy. The future's looking brighter, though. I think they need to take a while to warm up. The general findings of the report is that there's a crisis rooted in the economic and demographic stagnation. 2, Nova Scotia has the assets to turn around its current outlook. And 3, most significant impediment to the turnaround is the lack of a shared vision. So, given that this is a panel in a social political thought conference, you're going to have to indulge us in some ways, because the way in which we're going to approach this report is maybe different than what you have experienced or on the media or on other sort of policy analyst frameworks. So what can social political thought bring to the discussion of the Ivany report that, say, political science, sociology, economics, and public policy cannot? Instead of focusing on the many specific claims of the report, for instance, the need for a minister of business, the need for a project national, or increased immigration, the focus shifts towards the discursive and narrative frames, the conditions of possibility and buried assumptions at play in the text. By focusing on the discourses at play, for example, we would be attentive to the statements, the values, the actors, the histories, etc., that must be excluded in order to stabilize and naturalize the statements that are included in the report. We can also be attentive to the implications of the narrative frames. We can ask, what happens when you frame a policy discussion around crisis and catastrophe? What kinds of values, visions, futures, etc., what must necessarily be excluded if the charge of irresponsible is to be avoided? Further, if we ask the questions about the conditions of possibility for the Ivany report, we're not interested in following the money and looking for conspiracy necessarily. Instead, we're more interested in the ontological and epistemological, the questions of being and the questions of knowledge themselves that limit the project. Finally, if we're attentive to these buried assumptions in the text, we can identify the affective or emotional drives, that the enabling myths, the promissory rhetoric, and the social and political, economic, and historical patrimonies that stabilize the project. So for these reasons, we thought it would be useful to treat this text not as a policy paper, but as a strange work of high theory or fiction. By pushing the text beyond its intended function, we queer the text and can begin to reveal the idiosyncratic particularities of its call to action. So look, today we interrupt the function of this text. We do not complement it by serving as experts that explain or contest the text, and instead we want to open the text to other kinds of horizons. As such, we invite all of you, this is why we've organized it as a round table, to participate in that practice with us. As members of this round table, we ask you to join us in making this text stutter and to give it a future that it never expected to have. So on that basis, I invite Dr. Biro first. I think you were listed first in the program.
Oh, great.
And I think now I need to have a program so I know who goes after. We could just.
You have.
Yeah.
I was going to say you have 6 minutes to find one.
Right.
Yes.
I do. So go ahead.
Thank you.
I'll find one.
Yeah, I guess the advantage of going first means that I don't have to worry about other people saying the things that I'm going to say before I do. I guess I want to say maybe 3 or 4 things about the report, although I ended up taking about 7 or 8 pages of notes on it as I was reading it. And I was, I guess when we were talking about how to sort of divide up the work of this roundtable, I was sort of tasked or volunteered to do sort of the environmental or take on some of the environmental kind of issues that are in the report. So some of what I have to say has to do specifically with that. Others are more tangentially connected. I'll start though with a bit of actual, in spite of what Geoffrey just said, with a bit of empirical kind of claims testing about the report. I did do a quick content analysis, so this is some social science research in action of the report. Because one of the things that I found really striking for a report that is about laying the foundations for a new economy in Nova Scotia, Canada's ocean playground, a province that where 70% of the population lives in coastal communities. There's a real kind of silence about climate change or global warming in particular. And that was apparent just on a kind of first brush through. So I tried to dig down a little bit on that issue. Did a search for global warming. In the 80 or so pages of the text, the term does not appear once in 80 pages, right? I think that's a kind of striking absence, but maybe it's explainable because not everybody uses that term, right? Global warming. Some people prefer the term climate change. So I did follow that with a search for climate to see what the document has to say about climate. And the word climate does appear 6 times in the document. So global warming is absent, but climate appears 6 times. 3 times of those 6, there's a reference to the macroeconomic climate. One reference to the, quote, climate for risk-taking and business development. One reference to the attitudinal climate, and obviously attitudes are a major focus of the report. And one reference that's actually weather related. There's a reference to Nova Scotia's cooler climate and how that's conducive to growing premium varieties of apples. So that's it for climate. Obviously, there's more in the document about environment or environmental sustainability than climate change. And in fact, it is one of the 3 identified fault lines when they did the town halls or citizen engagement process. They identified 3 fault lines in citizens' attitudes, one of which is a kind of fault line or tension between natural resource extraction on the one hand and a desire for environmental protection on the other. So it is found there. And one of the broad themes that comes out of this, again, process of citizen engagement is the theme of sustainability and growth, right? And I think if we're looking for a kind of promissory note or a moment of promise in that document, it's in that theme of sustainability and growth, although maybe not where one might expect to find it. And hopefully I will be able to come back to that and say everything else that I want to say in the middle. So one thing that sort of came up as this panel was being discussed on Twitter a little bit was the idea of catastrophe. So the report actually doesn't say very much about catastrophe, right? That's the theme of the conference, but not really the theme of the report. But it does talk a lot about crisis. And I think in this sense, it's emblematic of something much broader, right? The discourse of crisis is one that is not exclusive to the Ivany report. In fact, we could say it's ubiquitous in politics today, right? We can think about not only discourse of environmental crisis as another obvious example, but crisis in education, whether we're talking about P-12 education, crisis in post-secondary education, crisis in policing, and so on. Everywhere we look, we're faced with crises. So what's at stake in this language of crisis? Well, the term crisis, if you go back to its etymological root, actually comes from the Greek and has a specific kind of medical provenance, which is crisis is a turning point, right? It's a point where the patient either makes a turn for the better or a turn for the worse. So it has that specific meaning of not just there are bad things going on, but there's a turning point or a potential turning point at play. So in that sense, I think it's accurate to say that this document is trying to manufacture a crisis, or to quote one of Mike Harris's ministers in the early 1990s, to invent a crisis. What is it that needs to be turned? What's the attitudes of Nova Scotians, and specifically their attitudes towards growth, right? And the need to accept a growth imperative, the need for dynamism, the need for flexibility, the need for innovation, the need to celebrate entrepreneurialism, and so on. So in that sense, too, it's in line with, again, a much broader kind of discourse that, if we can indulge some social and political thought, Zygmunt Bauman identifies as a kind of liquid modernity, right, where everything is constantly subjected to these kind of tests of innovation, entrepreneurialism, dynamism, flexibility, and so on. Okay. So the last thing maybe I'll say, if my 6 minutes aren't quite up, is to ask about the usefulness or effectiveness of this language of crisis. And I think, again, we have lots of examples that we can draw from. Environmentalists have been talking about a crisis or turning point for probably a quarter century. We'll say more about that on the faculty panel later this afternoon if you want to hear more. But how effective is this discourse of crisis? Well, again, we can look to the environmental example. If we're looking at whether the discourse of crisis achieves the stated goals in terms of changing people's attitudes or behaviors, the answer, I think, is probably not in most cases, right? Just screaming crisis doesn't affect the kind of changes that people want. But what it can be effective at is preempting a kind of deliberative, democratic process, right? And the very title of the report, Now or Never, is one that tries, I think, to preempt a kind of discussion about what the future of the Nova Scotia economy might look like. And I'll just turn finally to that theme of sustainability and growth, and what the report says there is, and I'll quote, more consideration needs to be given to how communities envision their own success. Right? More consideration needs to be given to how communities envision their own success. I think that's the fundamental democratic promise that lies at the heart of this document, but is immediately buried under the weight of the title, Now or Never, and the juggernaut of crisis and the province-wide need to accept the premise of economic growth and population growth. Thanks.
Thank you, Geoffrey, for organizing this, and Christine for live streaming this for the CCPA and us. And thanks to everybody for coming on such a gorgeous day. You have great priorities. Thank you. I read this report through the theoretical lens of some work I'm doing right now, which is the feminist ethics of care. So I want to kind of present a little bit about what that is for those of you who might not be familiar with that framework, and then talk a little bit about how the report from the commission really presents very much the opposite of that, which I will posit actually helps us create a crisis in terms of building and sustaining vibrant communities that draw people to the province, and then ask some questions about what would this report actually, what kinds of questions are excluded, or what kinds of questions could be asked if we thought about this from an ethics of care framework. So just to give you a little bit of a background on that framework, the ethics of care theorists argue that we exist in relation to others. So we're not autonomous, isolated beings. Rather, we exist in relation to other people. That's the reality. And because we exist in relationship, or as part of existing in relationship to others, we are both givers and providers of care. So at various points in our life, we're care receivers when we're young. Then we shift into having a more care providing role as we are older. But we never cease to be givers and providers of care throughout our life. Now, some of the theorists of a democratic ethics of care, like Joan Tronto, will say that this idea of, in a liberal society that's founded on the ideas of individual rights, the idea that we're caregivers and receivers really gets buried. Care is something that takes place in the private sphere, and it's something that we have to worry about as individuals. And as such, we never really talk about what kind of care ought we to provide each other as a society. What kind of care should be provided? Who ought to do the providing, and how do we provide it? Is it public? Is it private? Is it nonprofit? All those kinds of things are actually buried, and they're not part of public discourse, but they should be, because if we don't bring them into public dialogue and political discourse, then we're just going to exacerbate the kinds of injustices that exist. The injustices that mean that certain people are always bearing the burden of care provision. Usually this is women, usually this is racialized minorities. And certain injustices are perpetuated or exacerbated because of the kind of care that people receive. So people who are living in poverty tend to receive much less care, and that has effects in terms of how they can live their lives, what kind of ways they can participate in society. So if we ignore care and if we push it into the private, we're exacerbating injustices. Now, the Ivany report actually, in my reading of it, excludes the question of care, or our ability to bring care into a public dialogue. And I think that this is a huge problem, because if we exclude questions of care, we're excluding the kinds of questions that pertain to quality of life that are so important for developing and sustaining healthier, more vibrant, more equitable communities. Quality of life is mentioned in the report, but it's really assumed to be a byproduct of economic growth. When you know, there's very much a rising tide lifts all boats kind of theme throughout this document, and a trickle down kind of theme. So as long as the economy is growing, everything else is going to be okay. And we know that the Ivany report makes some important assumptions that really exclude the idea of care as a fundamental part of our society. So the economy is understood as a for-profit, growth-oriented, primarily for-profit, growth-oriented institution. People are understood to be primarily not care receivers and givers or relational, but economic actors. All of our institutions are called on to foster our economic agency rather than on other parts of our being. And as a result, because this is so oriented to creating a for-profit, growth-oriented economy where that's what we all do, that's how we're all oriented, there's no room in this report for thinking about a flourishing, for example, care economy. That includes childcare, that includes education as a much broader kind of institution than what's presented. That includes anti-poverty work, that includes human rights work, that includes healthcare, that includes elder care. And I think when we exclude all of that from consideration, we are exacerbating a crisis, or we're creating a crisis, because do we really want to live in a society? Who's going to come here if we are not taking care of each other, right? If we're only concerned about growth and trade. So I just want to end with a few questions about how our conversation might actually shift, and how we might rethink the idea of the economy if we gave some attention to the economy as embedded in a society rather than as the primary root of a society, but as the economy as an institution that's embedded in a society where questions of care are given importance, primary importance even, okay? So could we imagine a public policy that addressed poverty and inequity not just as something that will automatically be resolved if a rising tide lifts all boats, but as something that requires deliberate strategies, deliberate policies, deliberate redistribution of wealth? Can we imagine schools that foster the development of the whole student? So the intellectual development, the physical development, the mental and emotional development, the creative development, the community-minded and oriented development, not just schools as institutions that are training people to be entrepreneurial. Can we imagine how childcare, a la Quebec, could provide jobs and actually free working age parents to participate in the workforce in new and creative ways rather than not talking about this at all? Could we imagine an innovative economy in elder care? One of the things that I found really, really striking in this report was that the aging population is itself considered a crisis. And it's almost like old people are a problem. Bill, that's you. You are a problem. It's almost like old people are a crisis instead of a key part of our community with history and all sorts of experience. And this isn't, that Logan's Run movie, right? So can we imagine where we're all gone at 30, right? Could we imagine what it would be like economically if we actually focused on elder care as a priority? So these are some things that we can consider. What would Nova Scotia look like if we cared for each other in addition to profits and growth? And that's 6 minutes.
Nice.
Well played. Yeah, it was interesting in preparation for the panel.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Jim. I'm right now. I'm like I'm at a 12-step program or something. So anyway, but I'm Jim. It's really interesting how eclectic this is. How varied but complementary this is. When we were meeting as participants on the panel, or the microcosm, which will be larger participants. It was neat when we would discuss this document because there were phrases or words used to describe this report, such as schizophrenic, such as fearful. There was discussion of neoliberalism, but at the same time, the word mercantile would come up. And it was really interesting. And the last time we met, I left, thinking about that and thinking that was such a fascinating conversation that all of us are perplexed at what this is. And so I was drawn to remembering the work of Hugh Dauncey and how he would look specifically at certain aspects of French society and culture. And he would suggest that there's actually particular aspects within France that create this complementary pre-modern, modern, and postmodern dynamic. And I thought it was really interesting because when you hear words like mercantilism and neoliberalism, you don't necessarily think of that as being within the same rubric, right? And so when you read this report, you do hear these type of themes like rural and urban, or the artisanal entrepreneur and this kind of industrial machine, or emigration and immigration, and you see all these themes. And so I was thinking about Dauncey's discussion, not that this articulates in any type of nuanced fashion as he does, but there are certain overlapping or specific themes that the document may present. So one of the particular tones that I felt is repeated over and over again is this individualistic emphasis. And it's not in and of itself an individualism, but even the document itself, which was solely composed by hundreds and hundreds of people coming together within frameworks of civil society, complemented by economic number crunchers and political commentators and facilitators of multimedia, et cetera, yet the document itself has been completely encapsulated with this individualistic tonality of the Ivany report. And I think that is extremely important and very politically effective. But that's just the framing of the document itself as this kind of individualistic representation. The actual text spends a significant amount of time emphasizing the individual Nova Scotian, right? Whatever that will end up being in this discussion. But that the Nova Scotian, in and of themselves, not only will, recognize and situate themselves within this apocalyptic, dynamic that they find, but that the Nova Scotian, in this kind of selected geographical solidarity, will also, through its own meritocracy, be able to respond through the uplifting of the bootstraps. So we see a really interesting dichotomy of the pre, the modern, and the post, all within this kind of mismatched, or probably more accurately, like this collision of a series of tones. The individualism itself is highly important because it situates the document within a very specific time and space. So if this is not the actual work of civil society coming together, sharing ideas, trying to look at solutions, et cetera, but if it's rather situated as it is and propagated as it is as the Ivany report, then what happens is that situates this document with a very specific moment, okay? And in the context of that moment, within the discourse of that moment, what we also have is this moment of individuals who will either respond or fail in the document. So what we do is, we don't actually look at the causality of why the hell we have this document to begin with. We don't look at the structural reasons of why we're actually at this place of crisis, but rather, in this moment in time, can Ivany or the Nova Scotian respond therein? And there's a whole series of subtexts which are fairly, I suggest, far more frightening which can come out of this individualism. But maybe that can come out with the discussion itself.
Thanks, Michael Dennis, from History. Speaking of frightening, I'm going to turn directly to the document for a moment. and I'm going to read to you certain sections I find particularly alarming and disturbing, and then perhaps point out some historical analogies that challenge some of the basic assumptions in the Ivany report. So here we are then on page 52. Now we read that some societies are characterized by relatively high levels of unified purpose and vision, and for them, leadership for long-term transformative change is expected of the elected government. References are made in the report to recent examples of Scotland, Scandinavian countries, Australia. While the Commission proposes that Nova Scotia work to become this kind of dynamic and purpose-driven province, this is not now our current political culture, and we must therefore start from a different place, overcoming, if you will, divisions, overcoming countervailing powers, those who challenge, if you will, the existing distribution of resources. It seems to be implicit then in this section of the document. There are other examples, however. In times of war or other national emergency, when democratic states have suspended the normal processes of partisan politics and sectoral competition to empower coalitions or unity governments to focus all available energies and resources on, again, overcoming the crisis that has been so eloquently outlined by my colleagues. And the business sector has supported such commitments, of course. During World War II, a number of senior business leaders volunteered to serve as dollar-a-year men, advisors to the national government to help plan and coordinate the war effort. Some variation on this option might serve well in the collective effort to turn around our current prospects. And so I thought, as an historian, I'd turn to some of the evidence and maybe to share with you exactly what some of those dollar-a-year men were doing, in fact, in positions of power. In the War Production Board, for example, in the United States, mobilization to increase profits, of course, moved ahead. By 1943, 100 companies had gained 70% of defense production. Consolidation, concentration of wealth and power. The Roosevelt administration, of course, advanced all this, and in the interest then of wartime mobilization, these corporations enjoyed protection from antitrust protection and from rising competition. And the government provided financial incentives and also made sure these companies made a little money through cost-plus contracts, which guaranteed a profit regardless of the cost involved. So here we have then a little bit of sort of historical reconstruction, historical accuracy, challenging the myths, if you will, of the dollar-a-year man, and also raising some of the questions about the danger of the concentration of power. But turning again to another example, because of course World War II is so important, if we're going to think of a catastrophe or crisis, why not consider World War II for a moment? So I thought I'd look at Alvin Hansen, economist Alvin Hansen, grappling with the problems of the post-war era, the reconstruction of the American economy, the reconversion from wartime mobilization to peacetime production. So this surely is a monumental crisis the United States is facing, Canada faces as well. And what is he recommending? What is he suggesting? What is he positing as the solutions? Well, I thought I'd share with you what Alvin Hansen is suggesting. A prominent economist, works in the U.S. government, part of the National Resources Planning Board, again, the whole idea of economic planning. He suggests the following: recent trends in economic analysis point to the conclusion that this is wartime, 1945-46, the conclusion that a more equal distribution of income would tend to promote full utilization of productive resources. Once again, the conclusion that a more equal distribution of income would tend to promote full utilization of productive resources. What do we do after the crisis then? What's going to happen once all these veterans return, once we sort of convert, if you will, to peacetime production? The fear was we're going to have another depression. What he's talking about, of course, is a substantial redistribution of wealth. He goes on to say the following, and this is quite remarkable. Again, 1945-46, prior, of course, to the era of McCarthyism. He says if purchasing power is maintained at a high level, we need have no fears that private manufacturers, retailers, wholesalers, and farmers will not come forward. They'll materialize and supply the market with goods demanded by the public, a rich variety of goods at reasonable prices. Private business can and will do the job of production, but, he argues, posits, it is the responsibility of government to do its part to ensure a sustained demand. Once again, it is the responsibility of government to do its part to ensure a sustained demand. So I'd like to suggest to you that the demand component is almost completely missing from the Ivany report. The idea of a more progressive distribution of wealth, analysis of the maldistribution of wealth. There is discussion about taxation policy, but nary a mention of the possibilities of adopting progressive taxation policies. So all of it is absent then, but additionally absent is any consideration of the mechanisms that traditionally have ensured a wider distribution of wealth. For example, labor unions. This is, of course, one of the major functions, economic functions of labor unions, is to extract profit and to distribute it more equitably. And what we have here in the report is an argument that those countervailing powers should abandon their position because they're too sectarian, too narrow-minded, too selfish, and should join in kind of a consensus, a business-led consensus, which will make all boats rise, but then will also decide, at the end of the day, how those profits will be distributed. So you have a whole bunch of contradictions built into the Ivany report. And I think that history illuminates, if you will, how earlier eras grappled with equal, if not larger, problems, cataclysms, economic catastrophes. And here we have, of course, the argument for full employment. Again, no discussion about full employment in this report. But I thought if I had a few more moments, I would just point out a few more things. And again, sort of on the level of contradictions. On page 39, we have the discussion of a skilled workforce. And there's plaudits given, of course, to a skilled workforce, craftspeople, for example, diversified labor market, these kinds of things. And a page later, page 48, we're told we have an uncompetitive labor market. So we have a skilled workforce, but we also have an uncompetitive labor market. And I'm trying to reconcile these two, and I'm finding it difficult to really make the two gel. Perhaps you can help me as we work through this. But it seems that, again, this is one of the contradictions built into the report, because what it's raising is the possibility that James is absolutely right. I have no doubt that he is. He usually is right, frankly. Which is that this is not simply about making the province more competitive. It is about ratcheting up, if you will, the discipline of the labor force, making that labor force more productive. And as they say in the American South, it's either a stretch out, or intensification of labor, one or the other. So it's kind of a question of how you want to go. And it seems as if this is implicit, that workers will bear the burden of greater productivity, the stretch out, or the intensification, one or the other, working longer hours, working harder over a shorter period of time. So I thought I'd mention that, the whole question of the contradiction between a skilled workforce but an uncompetitive labor market. But I also want to finish off by masquerading as a Canadian historian for a moment, not an American historian. But I thought, dig into a little Canadian history. And perhaps just remind ourselves, but also remind the authors of the report of a tradition of resistance in Nova Scotia, which is absolutely absent. There is some discussion about cooperatives in the report. There is some discussion, about sort of alternative community development groups, but there is no discussion of this. A cadre of Atlantic Canadian scholars have been able to discern, if you will, that the Maritimes were the staging grounds for nationally progressive political movements. Not backward, not conservative, not hidebound. Progressive political movements such as women's suffrage, the social gospel, and labor activism. The latter decades of the 20th century witnessed radical movements within the region. Popular protests resulted in the nationalization of the Sydney steel industry. Again, democratic economic planning, if you will. New Brunswick nurses demanded valuation for their labor. In a series of wildcat strikes in the 1970s and 1980s, and popular environmentalism influenced the Sydney tar pond cleanup efforts during the 1990s and early 2000s. And so I want to leave, my part of the discussion on this note. Is there an argument to be made that perhaps, with the focus, of course, on the rural area of Nova Scotia, there's an argument to be made that the authors of the report are really suggesting that the rural Nova Scotians have yet to be dragged into, if you will, the competitive logic, of the modern, now post-industrial economy, that they are somehow still resisting, if you will, the logic of the time clock, the discipline, if you will, of capitalist production, capitalist social relations. That in many ways what we have are perhaps what Eric Hobsbawm called primitive rebels. People who are still willing to challenge, question, raise objections to the idea that one's entire life should be organized around the dictates, around the prerogatives, around the demands, if you will, of production for profit.
Great, thank you. My contribution to this part, often when you raise questions about this report, say, well, our experience in a faculty meeting or anywhere, the response will always be, well, did you read the report? And there's an interesting function that happens there, because you should read this report, but you should read it with care. And the reason why you should read it with care is because it's an apparatus of capture. Every single idea, the kinds of questions that you might have a place within the framework. But as they have a place within the framework, they are placed in a certain kind of location so that they no longer have the bite or the promise that you thought they might. And it's a very interesting document that functions in that way. I read this report as a work of aesthetic and effective governance. The aesthetic frame is that of catastrophe, and that creates the necessary effective condition, fear, to ensure willing and even enthusiastic compliance, governance. This form of aesthetic effective governance fits into a much older tradition. Namely, the Ivany report is a political Jeremiad. It is a righteous prophecy of doom that creates an intimate relationship between the prophet, Ivany, and the sinner, the Nova Scotian, so that the sinner can accept or even celebrate the criticism of the prophet as good news. Generally, in this theological tradition, a catastrophe is forecasted in order to quicken or change in behavior or attitudes of the community. It is through the repeated prophecies of doom that the people protect established authority and defend the status quo. In this way, the community is governed through crisis. The crisis is the mechanism in which we are being governed. In that way, the crisis has to be perpetually reproduced so as one affects a particular form of aesthetic effective governance. It is in and through catastrophe that we are governed. Catastrophe here is not the exception, it is the norm, and it is the status quo. Interestingly, a Jeremiad will always say that the status quo is not an option. Through fire and brimstone, the prophet prevails and arrives to get us to convert and change our ways. Because of this theological frame, the Ivany report can say essentially the same thing as Stephen Harper did, namely that Nova Scotians have a defeatist attitude. But instead of it being rejected as insulting, it is celebrated, repeatedly endorsed, enforced, broadcast at every single moment on the CBC, in senior policy meetings. The Ivany report is continually trotted out. Apologize for the slip. Always brought out, and it's celebrated. It's a hair shirt. It's a beating of ourselves in order to be able to take on and celebrate this catastrophic thinking. So catastrophic thinking manifests itself as a pessimistic form of thought. But what's interesting about it is that it always smuggles in a kind of empty optimism. The report repeatedly says, we can do it. It says, we can do it ourselves. But what this means, effectively, it will be done to us. It will be done to us either by the promises by catastrophe, or it will be done to us by ourselves. We're enacting the form of governance that then minimizes the kinds of dreams, potentials, visions, and so on that we could have. Some standard questions apply. Namely, who is this we? Who is this we that will do it? Who is this we that will have to bear the burden of the Ivany report? The Ivany report shifts responsibility from past errors and instead shifts them on contemporary populations. Bill 100 is a good example of governing in the rear view mirror. Administrations have made bad decisions in the past. This is Bill 100 is in relationship to universities. It says that you're allowed to use extraordinary, almost wartime measures to, right, effectively to annul certain kinds of liberties and rights and contracts and so on. So administrations have made bad decisions in the past. We happen to be sitting in one of them. The university now has a particular...
The acoustics are good though.
Right. The university now has a particular kind of problem, namely it's running a structural deficit. But the bill will then empower the administration to remove the entitlements from those that were not responsible for creating the problem in the first place. In fact, those who were holding the administration to check while these things were happening are the very ones who are now having their right to speak, to organize, and so on being removed. So a shared vision becomes, and I think this is the report, stop blaming us for stuff we did in the past and accept that you will now have to suffer while we prosper. That's the core message of the political Jeremiah. So here, I'll also end on some questions. Do any of the problems identified in the Ivany report justify the narrative of catastrophe and its exceptional political solutions, either that of a Project National or the War Measures Act? A catastrophe frame blinds us to the problems that persist in the Maritimes: monopoly capitalism, the Irvings, the Sobings, McCains, entrenched in historical forms of racism, federal isolation and enforced poverty. The second question, is focusing on changing attitudes of Nova Scotians productive if the very attitude that perhaps dominates Nova Scotia's political class is that of catastrophe thinking? The Ivany report is exemplary of the problem that he criticizes, certainly not its solution. And finally, I wonder about this thing called the sustainable vision, because I wonder, what is it that we are to sustain? A sustainable vision is absent of values. Sustainability is not a value statement. What is it that we want to sustain? Sustainability is an empty goal. The question that must always be asked is, what is being sustained at the cost of something else? What are the competing values that are being abandoned or suppressed in order to follow this urgent call for action on behalf of all Nova Scotians? So that's the end of my contribution. What I'd like to do is to open it up to a broader discussion. I will ask, given the nature of the exercise, to keep your statements less than 6 minutes, considerably less, in fact, maybe as concise a statement as possible, so that we can hear and participate in have voiced as many different thoughts as possible. I'll open it up to the table. And yeah.
I'll answer your question.
Yeah.
I don't think we should sustain growth. That's not small.
Right. Yeah. It is. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
It was a statement that that.
I was answering your question.
Right. That what is to be sustained in this document is growth, and growth is not sustainable.
Thank you.
Yep. Others who'd like to contribute? Yes.
Well, the other thing is, I'm from Baxtershire, small rural community, is the framing of actual sustainability, the framing of the alternative, is what gets thrown into the bus also. I just like to make note of that. So much fire and brimstone, forgetting that every day people go out and try to make the sustainability happen here and always have. So where does that get framed?
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of economics, I hope people are familiar with the work of Rocco, Galanti, and Comer. The economics of the Depression era and the challenge now with the Bank of Canada in terms of banking services for 3 levels of government. That was the original intent. Well worth researching.
Thank you. Other contributions?
I guess I have a question. So, like, you mentioned, like, this catastrophe, and I think it's, like, it also reminds me of, like, when populism rise in Western Canada, like, in the 30s, when, like, the CCI and Democratic came to power, there was, like, a vogue of catastrophe and be like, you know, we have, like, a semi-colonized swimming trip to, like, Eastern Canada and stuff. So, like, I guess my question is, like, do you sense, like, there's a similar political atmosphere?
Great. Andrew, you seem to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, I think there is that kind of, certainly a history of a kind of discourse of that kind of semi-colonization in Atlantic Canada vis-a-vis the federal government, or Upper Canadians. But in that document, there's very little of that, right? And in fact, it expressly rejects that kind of, it just says, the federal government is what it is, and that's kind of it, right? So no real attempt to recuperate or to amplify that kind of sense of collective identity through that shared grievance, right? Of we've been disadvantaged by the structures of Canadian federalism, by the federal government policies or whatever. Right? It's strikingly absent, I think, in the report.
Can I respond to that too?
Of course.
In response to the regional colonization, it's interesting because if you look at Atlantic Canadian political economy during the 70s, because, as Michael highlighted, because of our skilled workforce, industrialized workers were making more than any other sector in the country. More than industrial workers in Quebec, more than industrial workers in British Columbia. And it was due to the wage controls that might have been Michael touched on during the 70s that the Trudeau government brought in place, which was there to cripple and really kind of disempower the Atlantic Canadian worker so that they would be expendable, easily exploited, and also processed to move to places where work wouldn't be paid so well. And so the interesting thing is then we also see the linkage, or maybe a creation of this regional colonization, which doesn't actually exist, but as Geoffrey kind of points out, it's manufactured. It's actually this kind of narrative that's created and then systematically formulated pragmatically, so it actually, fiction becomes nonfiction. So the interesting thing is then we also displace, if we think of it as regional colonization, we displace the similarities or the linkages that we actually have with the migrant workers coming here. So part of the report is a huge emphasis on emigration and immigration. So as this body of Nova Scotians leave, there's this need to bring in externalities to work in the fields, the bucolic beauty, whatever. But the irony is, if we think of ourselves as a singular Nova Scotian, we don't actually carry the linkages that really is this colonization, or is really this a shared class relation that you have and I have. But because you're not Nova Scotian, there is a very racialized tension, as Rachel put forward, which actually creates a dislinkage between us as actual workers in Nova Scotia, or citizens within Nova Scotia, and who benefits are, necessarily the drivers of growth. So it's neat that, maybe the discussion of colonization is a fiction in and of itself.
Please.
I'm Carol Harris, and I was born in the next community up, Greenwich, and live in Wolfville now. When I read this, I want to thank you all because you've brought your particular view and strengths to a reading of this report. When I read the report, I was dismayed. I did not recognize Nova Scotia in it. I knew I'd been gone for a few years, but I didn't think it had disappeared to that extent. And what I'd like to focus on a bit is something that you brought up, Michael, and that's thinking about the strengths of Nova Scotia, which I didn't really see reflected in this, and the historical strengths. But not just the history, because that's been co-opted by a type of economy that's come out of Chicago and taken our Western world and Eastern world now by storm. We call it neoliberalism, I guess. But some of the things that are happening now, such as farm works, I believe farm works got a little mention, but it's a scheme for helping new agricultural starts in Nova Scotia. And a lot of young people are applying to that. And I feel that there are many things that are happening in Nova Scotia that are attracting young people. Yes, many workers go away. They always did and always should. It's wonderful to go away and come back. or not come back, whatever. We need that mix. But that constant message that we got of growth, that everything must grow, as you say, it's the frame of the whole report, was the antithesis of what I see as Nova Scotian. And I'm not a conservative, I know. That sounds like a very conservative statement, but I mean it in an economic sense. I think we're going beyond this in economics. We're realizing that the constant growth does not work. And I saw this document as growth, development, and more development. Is that the way you people read it too?
Well, I think what's interesting about the document is how little vision it has. You know, you turn to this document that is supposed to be the path forward, and there is absolutely nothing in it that articulates any kind of concrete path. There is no articulation of what should be valued. There is no articulation of how we should get from point A to point B. There's only, we have a crisis, and now we need to, maybe it'll give acknowledgement to an example of something that was creative here or there, but it's really a co-opting of those examples to give the sense that, that stuff is happening. But it's not, there's no articulation, it's a dereliction of duty, effectively, and we consistently face this, I think, in Nova Scotia, where our leaders continually fail us in terms of articulating meaningful, progressive and positive visions of the future so that we can discuss and engage with them and rub up a different couple ones against each other. Instead, we are always fed the same thing. So again, this is an empty document, and you walk into it, and all you end up doing is blaming yourself. Or blaming, maybe even more dangerous, is that you don't end up blaming yourself. You blame the person next door. You blame the person who you put it onto someone else, and you say, well, they have the wrong attitude. They're not being entrepreneurial enough. They should really just get their stuff together. But really, you know, I have a question. Who's going to read this document? I would say that the majority of people that are going to read this document are those who are going to be telling you what it means, as opposed to empowering all of you to take this document up and read it for yourselves and see how you're reflected in it. Because when you read it, as opposed to get the bullet points from the CBC or, well, as the Ivany report says, we need to increase immigration, what on earth does that mean? Right? So there's this emptiness. So I do recommend you read the document with care, with gloves on. Yeah.
It's also sort of good.
It seems to me that the document is actually an excuse for people to tell you what you should do.
Yep.
That it's so open to interpretation that you will hear various prescriptions as to what the Ivany report says that are mutually contradictory. But the point is, it's the people that have the power to tell you what you should do that are going to benefit from it, not the people who would like to make up their own mind. Also, I think one of the problems we have is that the word entrepreneur has been impoverished. Because entrepreneur is basically bringing together resources to accomplish an end. And you could be an economical entrepreneur to make money, or you could be a social entrepreneur to make change in society. And I think in the same context, we always think of growth as economic. But there's social growth also. There's growth in non-material terms that are really beneficial to us all. And we've got to reframe a lot of this away from homo economicus into real, live human beings that have lives beyond the dollar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just on that, just something that had come up in our discussions, and I don't want it to get lost, is that throughout the document you see a displacement of something which is valuable called the economy, and the replacement of that concept of economy with something called business. We've had the economy taken from us, and it's been replaced with business schools. It's been replaced with business as a particular kind of vision of the economy, as opposed to the economy being, to echo Rachel's point, something which is embedded in society, right? And so in the same way that we need to take back the economy, we need to, it's ours, we make it happen. And so, but we give credit to businesses as if they do. Michael, or did you?
I was going to put my hand up. Do you want to speak first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess it's something that you've already kind of touched on a little bit and talked about, but this kind of idea of crisis and response, like, crises are generated and the way, the types of response which are orchestrated to this crisis. Because you kind of talked about the way that this catastrophe is being used as a mechanism of reinforcing the status quo, making us kind of more kind of homo economicus, kind of like react more with kind of like making ourselves more competitive, reorientate ourselves towards market forces. But actually, historically, this is quite exceptional. You know, like you kind of like, I mean, if you look at kind of people like Polanyi, when he was looking at the first time that market relations were penetrating the social relations of society, what he said was that actually, you know, depending on the way that social forces are mobilized, the response might be, you know, complete brutalization of society and destruction of society, or it might be kind of like the mobilization of forces of resistance to protect themselves from this kind of the devastation of kind of the reorientating of kind of society towards the kind of motives of profit and kind of market relations. So I was wondering why you think at this particular conjuncture, your analysis seems to be that it's kind of just crisis being used only as a way of reinforcing the status quo, which I think you've actually already answered in this kind of like this very individual way of kind of looking towards kind of everyone just reorientating themselves towards economic relations. But I was wondering why you think that that's happened.
I'd like to suggest that the resistance is stronger than anticipated. I think that might be, one of the key answers. And again, I'll go to the evidence for a moment from the report. Here we have the Community Economic Development Agency holding sort of, meetings, if you will, in local communities and extracting information and insight from participants about what they want. And here we have sort of, conflicting, contradictory testimony, but still giving us a sense that there are oppositional worldviews active. Communities are surviving the crisis. We are moving past grief and denial to clear understandings of realities. We are developing new leadership, moving past dependency. Well, that's fine. We have strength and resilience. We have a strong sense of community. We are able to build historical identities and traditions. This is coming from people on the ground level, so this is not a bureaucrat saying this. This is sort of the evidence, accumulated from people in these local meetings. We have openness to change in individual and community levels, pride in community, creativity at a community level. We are committed to self-reliance and within a strong cooperative tradition. So here you see that kind of ambivalence, that sort of, we've got this tradition of cooperation, community autonomy, community independence, calling our own shots, not being sort of subjected, if you will, to the rigors and the discipline of the marketplace. But we're also, in our responses, echoing, if you will, the tenets, if you will, of competitive individualism, hyper-capitalism, hyper-individualism. And so there's a great deal of confusion. And out of that confusion, there is also opposition, resistance. There's an advocacy for people taking risks, individuals. So risk now has to be downloaded on individuals. It's not public institutions, or even for that matter, major corporations. Individuals have to bear the risk, and they have to reap the rewards of an allegedly beneficial free trade regime. And yet the evidence again suggests that some of the most important periods of growth, not just in Nova Scotia, but in Canada, were of course during periods of significantly regulated trade, during controlled trade, if you will. In other words, tariffs. And here we have then, I think, the evidence once again that there is a tradition of opposition, that these folk cultures continue to exist, that there is a kind of resilience, but it's a resilience that is in opposition to and is holding off, if you will, the rationalization that's now being advocated for those who are concerned about one thing, I think, which is the crisis of profitability. I think that's what's driving much of this.
And I don't know who might respond to this, but if you might say a little bit about how the metaphor of crisis recasts the notion of political agency. And I'm going to kind of contrast it with something. And if you think about sort of the war language, that is still a language. I mean, if you think about the use of that metaphor, lots of places where, in some ways, it was not well chosen, but it's interesting in certain times that that language was mobilized. So, of course, you have First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, things get more complicated with the notion of war there, and national interest. But then you get spilling off of that in the American tradition, the war on poverty, totalitarian captain of the lifeboat, how do we get through this sense, and we're kind of victims of circumstance individually, and sometimes individually we've got to mobilize. And I'm just wondering if someone might comment a little bit on that sort of shift in metaphor and how that changes the notion of political agency, because clearly in a kind of free trade, global free trade domain, that notion of what nations can do on the behalf of collective interest has really disappeared. And I think in some ways the Ivany report is an expression of the absence of that national story.
Yeah, go ahead. We have to wrap it up in order to be ready for the next. So maybe just concluding thoughts, but with
very quickly,
a minute or something.
Yeah. I'd just like to see in response to Paul's question, the whole idea of sacrifice, national sacrifice, unity through the Second World War. The objective was always very clear, the four freedoms, and Roosevelt made it very clear what the purpose is, and it raised the question that Geoffrey was getting at. Exactly what values is this report targeted at? What kind of society do we hope to sustain? Going back to the World War II analogy, it was very clear. It was against totalitarianism, it was against fascism, it was in support of the idea of economic democracy, implying once again, a wider and more equitable and more democratic distribution of what the United States was producing. That was very clear in the American conception of what that war meant, as well as the war on poverty. But things have changed.
Great.
Paul, I just want to in response, one of the things that I thought was striking about this report is that actually, I think its attempt to move us all beyond politics. It's an ask for us to be a kind of in a post-political society, because we're all supposed to kind of abandon our partisan ideas, our sectoral, our interests, except for this one projet national. And there's a point, I can't remember where it is, but it says, essentially we need our provincial leadership to be the vanguard, and let's all just get in line behind that. So it's a very kind of, it takes away political agency, I think, from the citizen, and
under a minister of business. Under
a minister of business, yeah, and really empowers the provincial government, which right now doesn't really fly with me.
Thanks. Just really quickly, one response to Carol's question about growth, right? I mean, it's a really striking thing. This is on page VII, right near the beginning. They said, the report says, "We do not, as a province, share broad agreement on the need for economic growth." Okay, we do not share agreement on the need for economic growth. And we have divergent and often conflicting ideas about how best to achieve it. A couple of sentences later, this lack of solidarity as a province undermines constructive dialogue about our future, and so on. There's one sentence where it says we don't agree about the need for economic growth, and then it's immediately buried, and then we get 70 more pages about how important economic growth is, and everybody better get behind it. The other thing I'll just mention in that context, just a plug for the CCPA Nova Scotia. A few years ago, Larry Haven and Mathieu Dufour did a report called Hardworking Province, where they looked at economic trends in the province over the last couple of decades. They went from the early 90s to, I think, 2007 or 2008 or something. And what they found was that over that period, there have been increases in productivity, there have been increases in economic growth, and no increases in average weekly earnings, no increases, in other words, in incomes for the vast majority of the province. That all of that economic growth, all of that increase in productivity went to a very small portion of in the province and out of the province. And so I think that's worth noting in terms of this context of, or this assumption that a rising tide will lift all boats and we'll all be better off if we can just grow the pie.
I would like to make an invitation to you all. We'd like to sort of create a counter Ivany report, a people's report. And so I'd like to invite you all to make submissions written about 1,000 to 1,500 words, jargon-free, accessible language. And what we're going to do is we're going to compile them. And we're going to publish them and circulate them widely in Nova Scotia. So if you would like to if you have thoughts and you would like to sit down and commit them to your typewriter or whatever it is that, and you, please send them to me. We'll sift through them and engage with some kind of process and put it out perhaps before the next election. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. This is the end of our roundtable. It was very exciting to see you all here. I hope that perhaps we could do similar kinds of things in the future. And I would, of course, be open to those kinds of invitations so that we can think about how to do this in different kinds of ways.
Time frame for the submission? Time frame for the when do you?
Oh, that's very practical.
Now or never.
I'm a theorist. Sometime in the space-time continuum. I would say, let's say 2 months. Is that a good time to?
End of summer.
That's good.
End of summer? Yeah, summer project for you all. Some homework. Welcome back to Acadia. Make your submission.
Or maybe a shorter than end of summer, just to express interest.
Express interest, yeah.
Say like, I'd like to write
Get in
something
contact
about.
with me. Yeah, Geoffrey Whitehall, g.whitehall@acadiau.ca. Thanks again for coming.